voice does communicate so much more meaning than what you can read. No matter how well written it is, it's still the voice that really carries the meaning and the feeling of that. And you know, as a voice actor, how important that is, and how much more it communicates.
Welcome to Audio Branding, the hidden gem of marketing. Sound plays a more important role in human behavior and our decision-making than you may realize. In this podcast, I'll help you understand the art and science of sound so you can better influence others in business and your life. I'm your host, Jody Krangle. Let's delve a little deeper. This is the second part of my interview with Jeff Vidler. I'm curious as to what you've seen change over the last 10 years, maybe in listening habits, I guess, besides the rise of podcasting, which I mean, it's been around for more than 10 years, I think, but.
We're you're getting close to 20 now. Actually,
yeah. So I'm curious what your take is on that.
Well, I mean, I think the biggest thing that's happened is technological, which is smartphones.
Mm-hmm.
And not just, smartphones been around since 2007 or earlier, if you remember the Palm Trios and all that. But let's just start with the iPhone in 2007. But, it's taken time for people to get full penetration, and then for people to really use them, keep them with them all the time, and really learn all the things they could do with them and how that smartphone can solve problems for them.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that smartphones do is it solves the problem of downtime. When my mind is free, but my eyes are busy.
Yes.
And I'm bored.
Uh-huh.
On my smartphone, I can find audio that my eyes may be busy because I can't watch anything, and I may not be in one spot where I can do that, but I have audio that I can listen to music. I can listen to podcasts to keep me engaged and make my life less boring.
So it fulfills that thing that happened when we were driving long distances and listening to talk radio.
That's right. Can you imagine, driving in a car for long distance without listening to the radio? Well, the smartphones kind of help to solve that problem for people in their everyday life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The best example I can think of is did a focus group. This is several years ago. A millennial house painter, and he said, he spends 8 hours a day painting walls. His eyes are busy, but man, his mind is totally free. And he was like probably the ultimate power podcast listener I've ever known, because he said I would go crazy.
I love it.
If I didn't have podcasts to listen to. And he was the guy who turned me on to Dan Carlin's Hardcore History.
Oh.
Because episodes that go 5 hours, not a problem if you're a house painter, right?
That's great. Yeah, they were made for him. That's perfect.
But that's really what's happened is that more and more audio is being consumed.
Mm-hmm.
And music streaming is part of that. Podcasting is part of that. And radio has actually remained remarkably resilient in the face of all of that. With all of that new audio being consumed, yes, it is nipping at the margins for radio in terms of time spent listening. But radio has been remarkably resilient compared to, say, newspapers.
Oh, yeah.
Or even television over the last few years. What streaming has done to television in the last few years, that hasn't happened to radio to the same extent.
Sure. Well,
Radio's been hit in the last year because of the pandemic and people not commuting to work.
Yeah.
But presumably, hopefully, they'll start doing some of that again, and radio listening will bounce back up. But even still, I mean, it's at the reach of radio is at 90% of what it was the month before the pandemic. So
okay. Not too bad.
Yeah, but it's definitely a dip, but I expect we'll see some of that bounce back for sure.
Well, you can also get internet radio. Like you can get radio on your cell phone now, like on your smartphone. So, same way that you would get a podcast. If you really wanted to listen to a local radio show, you could get it on your phone.
And people do. And the streaming of radio has increased. And actually, it's increased a lot during the pandemic.
Interesting.
For that reason. The other thing that's going on technologically is smart speakers.
Yes.
And obviously that's all about voice in so many different ways. But it's an opportunity for people to listen to audio on command. They haven't really figured out the podcasting thing very well with either Google or Amazon. It's very hard to get anything but the most recent episode of the podcast you might be like to listen to. You can't go back to old episodes. And even sometimes it has a hard time finding the podcast you're looking for. But radio is actually quite simple. And I mean, radio's advantage has always been so easy and convenient. Well, there's nothing easier than just saying, hey, play me, blah, blah, blah radio station.
Mm-hmm.
And having it, you don't have to reach over and turn it on. It's not like even in the car where you don't have to reach over and turn it on, right? All you have to do is say, play me that radio station.
That does make it a lot easier.
So it is making a difference, and particularly actually in households with younger demographics,
Mm-hmm.
where a lot of them, I mean, only about 50% in Canada, the most recent survey, only about 50% of 18 to 34-year-olds have a regular radio in their home, but 43% have a smart speaker.
Okay, yeah.
So when you think of having something that you can listen to the radio on, 18 to 34-year-olds have as many opportunities to listen to radio as people in older demographics. Now, they don't listen as much, but still, 18 to 34-year-olds listen to radio as much as more than 18 to 34-year-olds will watch network television or certainly read a newspaper.
Sure.
Radio, again, is resilient even with the younger demos where, they have so many other options available to them that they use.
Very true. Yeah. Speaking of these different segments, what does the data that you're gathering tell you about the use of sound in particular markets? And what particular markets are you looking at? Are you looking at demographics? Are you looking at geography?
Actually, all of those things. If I look at the Canadian podcast listener study that we do, which is a landscape study of podcast listening in Canada, and we've been we're going into the 5th year for that study now. We do break out those results by demographic, but also look at it by region and even have a large enough sample that we're able to drill down into some of the larger cities as well.
Interesting.
So, you do see a clear pattern of podcast listening. First of all, it still is early adopter profile.
Okay.
It still, does skew towards 18 to 34-year-olds, but a significant number of 35, 54, and even 55 plus listening. In fact, the 55 plus listening seems to be growing.
Oh, okay.
As
Good
time
to
goes
know.
on. But yeah, I mean, it's, again, it sort of follows the traditional pattern of any new media that it's, the younger demographics are the first to embrace it. And it's also urban versus rural. So you look at cities like Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, they all punch well above the weight of their respective regions, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, the audience is actually quite diverse too. Because you have a young audience living in urban areas, and that tends to be a diverse audience as well. So it's really interesting on that side. And radio, as I said earlier, does skew a bit older, 35 to 54-year-olds who commute to work. And again, we'll all start doing that more in the near future, we think, or we hope.
We hope, yeah.
That's a key demographic for radio.
Mm-hmm.
And music streaming is kind of in the middle. You've got music streaming, certainly younger demographics, are and particularly when you get to paid music streaming, they will pay for it and listen. But older demographics will listen to music streaming as well. It's an audience not unlike podcasts, but it's a little bit older for the most part.
I know we're all dealing with a lot these days, so I really wanted to acknowledge those that have gone out of their way to leave an honest review of this podcast. Like Martha, who writes, "Fave. Listening to this podcast really helped my company's audio branding. I love the 2-part episode with Tom Eamonson. They complemented each other well, too." Thanks, Martha. I really appreciate your comments, and I'm glad you enjoyed the show with Tom. That's one of my favorites, too. He was really great to talk to. And for those of you that are interested, you can also leave a voice review now off of the main podcast page. It's super simple and fun, and I'd love to hear what you think. Now, back to the show. One question that I had, because I know that Apple has started describing this as following as opposed to subscribing. You've probably heard about
Yes.
that.
Yeah.
What do you think about that? Like, did they make a good choice? Does it matter? Do people really think of subscribing as paying for something?
Well, and one of the problems among people who haven't got the habit for podcast listening is that a lot of them actually do believe that subscribing means that they're going to have to pay for it, because other things that they subscribe to,
Mm-hmm.
TV streaming or their
Yeah.
music streaming service, is if you're going to subscribe to it, you're probably going to have to pay something. Um, I'm not sure how much of a barrier that is, or whether it's just a misconception that as soon as you start listening to podcasts, you realize that's not the case. But I think it's, also just moving away. What's happening with podcast listening as well is it is moving away from being something that people download on their device to listen to later. And the subscription part of it was perfect because it would download those podcasts for you. But going back to the early days of podcasting in the iPod, I mean, the beauty of downloading was it would take sometimes overnight for those podcasts to download into your phone.
That's true. Doesn't
And
take that long anymore.
you would only do that at home
Yeah.
because it would absolutely destroy your data usage.
Yeah, totally.
To do it any other time. But now, data usage charges are dropping. I mean, to download a podcast, when you're not on your local Wi-Fi is not really going to break the bank in terms of your data charges.
Mm-hmm.
And so more and more listeners are not manually downloading episodes.
Mm-hmm.
And that means they're not necessarily subscribing to episodes either. That was sort of part of the behavior that went with that RSS feed
Sure.
downloads. But of course, when you think you're streaming a podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or any of the other platforms, you are actually still downloading that podcast,
Yeah,
right? It
they
is
don't tell you
progressively
that.
It is progressively downloading it so that you can listen to it. Otherwise, you'd have huge buffering issues and everything else. So, so that's how it counts in terms of when a publisher is saying, "Here's how many people download my podcast." Well, that includes people who are pressing and playing. But I think moving away from the subscription thing is part of that, is just moving away from that whole notion around I'm downloading a podcast to listen to later, right?
Yeah.
And it is, I think, a response to the fact that some people are confused about the fact that subscription may mean they have to pay for podcasts, and maybe it will help to bring more people into the tent because there's still relatively, still maybe half of the population has really listened to podcasts, right?
Yeah.
We got a long ways to go to get to that full critical mass for everybody listening to podcasts and on a regular or weekly basis. Right now, the numbers vary depending on where you are, but we're seeing in Canada somewhere around 20 to 24% of people, of all Canadians, listen to podcasts on a weekly basis. US, I think it's a little bit higher than that. I think the most recent number I saw was 28%. But that means there's still 70% plus of the population that doesn't listen to podcasts.
That's true. What do you think would have to happen for more people to listen?
I think a lot of it is just time and habit and people
Yeah.
getting pulled into the and it's interesting because we've done research on this in terms of how do people get pulled into podcasting. And there's various reasons. A lot of it is word of mouth. People talk about a podcast. You got to listen to this podcast by so and so, but also it comes from celebrities. Or people you're fans of that you want to know more about them, and maybe you go to their website and you see that they have a podcast, and gives you a chance to go deeper. And then once you're in, then you've got then you're starting to listen to podcasts, and you start listening to other podcasts. Or maybe you have a niche interest. Maybe you have a hobby or a game. Maybe you're in you're knitting. You like knitting. And there's not many sources you can go to get a lot of information on knitting, but there are lots of knitting podcasts, and it's a community, right?
Sure.
And you can be part of that community by listening to that podcast. So, so we say a lot of the new podcasters coming into the medium are coming in on the heels of somebody they follow, that they're a fan of, and they find that they have a podcast or they're interviewed on a podcast. or they have a niche interest that they just want to go deeper and deeper and deeper. And one way to get really deep and super engaged is on a podcast.
I think it's really interesting, too, that this uses the human voice. And of course, we are predisposed to pay more attention to the human voice. That's just how we've been created.
That's right. Yeah.
So I can see how podcasts are going to reach into that psyche and sort of, work with it. But there's also interesting things like Clubhouse. We were talking about that earlier as well. And I think some people have said Clubhouse is like it's gonna take over podcasting, or I don't know what your thoughts are on that. Mine are probably that I think it'll enhance. I think it will help. I don't think it's gonna take it over. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't think it will take it over either. I think it's a different kind of experience. Being part of something, interacting with something in real time is different than sort of, settling into a podcast and losing yourself in a podcast and a story that's being told. I find it easier to multitask while I'm listening to Clubhouse than I can when I'm listening to a podcast.
Interesting. Why is that?
Just because the podcast, a really good podcast, every word, I don't want to miss a single word that's being said.
I see what you mean.
In a conversation, and it's a bit like listening to talk radio. I kind of pick and choose kind of what's there. I said, oh, someone's talking about that, then I kind of zone in on it. But there's a lot of other chatter that goes there that isn't really, I'm not really as deeply engaged with as I would be with the podcast. So I think that's part of the difference. But the beauty of Clubhouse is that you can interact with some of those people that you love to follow on a podcast. You can actually get the chance to talk to them and ask them questions and hear them in their own voice. And I think, so it plays a different role. And I think complementary because, again, if a podcast host that is on Clubhouse, will people then go to the podcast after they've had that chance to interact with that celebrity or that expert on Clubhouse when that podcast is available to them, right?
One would hope. I think it's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, but going back to what you were saying too, just that the thing about voice that's amazing. I mean, to me, I think that voice is that kind of, the human voice is that place between text and video, in a really sweet spot. Voice does communicate so much more meaning than what you can read. No matter how well written it is, it's still the voice that really carries the meaning and the feeling of that. And as a voice actor, how important that is, and how much more it communicates. But unlike video, which has visual distractions and takes you away from that meaning, audio is a place that you can actually communicate even more, I believe, than either text or video. And because it does sit in that sweet spot, it gives more meaning than text, but it doesn't give so much context that you're getting lost in the visual distractions. And probably the best example of that, I mean, are you familiar with the Megalab truth test?
I'm not actually, but I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, this goes back to the UK, back in 1995. There was a British celebrity, and he was interviewed twice. In one interview, he told the truth. In the other interview, he told nothing but lies.
Oh, yeah. I think I have heard of this. I didn't know what the name of it was, but yeah.
So transcripts of both interviews were printed in the Daily Telegraph. They were shown on BBC TV and played on BBC Radio. So the readers, viewers, and listeners were invited to call in and identify the interview in which the celebrity was lying. They got more than 40,000 responses, and the result, 52% of TV viewers, 64% of newspaper readers, and 73% of radio listeners spotted the lie.
Oh.
So again, voice communicates more than text.
Yeah.
But without the visual distractions of video.
What a great demonstration. Yeah.
And that's what makes audio, the ability to create such magic with audio, right? Because you can communicate so much meaning.
It is really a beautiful way to communicate, which, that's what we're all doing in podcasting too. So I love it. And I love that you're researching all of this.
It's fun. I find, I must say that in the last 4 to 5 years, with the kind of explosion of audio consumption, particularly podcasts, it's reinvigorated my interest in being a researcher because there's so much to find out. There's so many things happening. There's so many rocks to lift up and see what crawls out. If you're curious at all, it's one of those things that, it really, when you get up in the morning, it's fun to go to work and get things done because you know that you're going to find out some really interesting things today that you didn't know about yesterday.
Oh, I love it.
It's not like you're just rinse and repeating, doing the same old research, finding the same old stuff over and over again, which for many years in radio research, that's what it was. You really weren't finding a lot of new things. You were helping, radio stations, understand how to make their shows a little bit better and get feedback on their programming. But there wasn't a whole lot of new things to learn. But in the last 10 years, and again, I go back to the smartphone and now smart speakers as kind of opening up a whole new vista for audio. And podcasting has been the most obvious example of that.
Are you looking for ways to improve your company's or podcast's impact? You'd be surprised how powerful the use of an intentional audio branding strategy can be. Want to know more? I have a free downloadable PDF that gives you my 5 tips for implementing an intentional audio strategy at voiceoversandvocals.com/audio-branding-strategy. That location does ask to put you on a mailing list, just to send you updates on when the new podcasts come out. But if you really don't want to give your email out, I understand. Just contact me directly. My email is all over my website, and I'll make sure you get that PDF without needing to sign up anywhere. If you do sign up, though, you also get access to a resources section called The Studio, where I have videos, white papers, and PDFs, discounts from my guests, and snippets of audio from my guests that no one else gets to hear. So maybe it's worth your while. Totally up to you. And of course, if you're looking for voiceovers, you can get in touch with me about that too. Now, back to the podcast. What are you working on right at this moment?
Right at this moment? A bunch of projects that are on the go.
Anything you could talk about?
As I say, I have to sort of think through my head, what can I actually reveal? I just finished we do an annual study for the Canadian radio industry called Radio on the Move. And it looks at radio listening patterns. It looks at technology. It looks at what people are listening to in terms of technology and also not just radio, but podcasts, streaming, all of that. So they understand what's happening with the audio landscape, where the opportunities are. So we just came out of field of that study about 3 weeks ago. So we're putting together the report for that, and that's going to come out next month. I can speak about that. We are doing we're doing a brand lift study for Charles Schwab on a podcast that they're doing. They want to get an idea of how the listeners are responding to it. So we're about to put that research into field. Also, we do a lot of work in Canada with a radio chain called Rogers, which is really one of the larger radio chains. We do brand tracking for them across the country. So we're right now, looking at the impact of contests and seeing,
Interesting.
What contests are people noticing, and are they really making people listen more to that radio station or not? Because there are opportunities during COVID where people are looking for financial support, and is that driving more people to play contests? And and what about some of the things, the contests that stations are doing? What's working and what's not? So, and that's probably as much as I should probably reveal. But there are a few other projects where we are working and developing a really what will be a really large study in the U.S. That will be coming out. We'll be working on getting set up and getting going over the next few months. So that's, but I can't really speak too much more about it than that.
That's okay. We'll touch base later. We'll find out more. So if people wanted to get in touch with you or follow you on social media, how would they do that?
Okay. Well, the website is signalhillinsights.com. And you can find out what the company does, and you can also find there how you can get in touch with us and also in touch with me. My email address is jeff.vidler@signalhillinsights.com. So that's fairly straightforward. I am on LinkedIn as Jeff Vidler. I am on Twitter at Jeff Vidler, Vidler. Thankfully, it's not a very common last name, so I didn't have to put a 1 or something after it. So it's as simple as that.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to hear from any other audio fans, because again, I'm always curious about what they're doing and what they're finding in the work that they're doing.
Well, you never know. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today. This was a lot of fun, and I actually learned a lot talking to you about this. It's a fascinating study, the study of studies. I like it a lot. And I guess I'll see you on Clubhouse.
Yeah, you bet. Well, yeah, or hear you on Clubhouse.
Or hear you. Yes, exactly. Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me on your podcast, and I'm going to keep listening, because there's some great conversations on audio branding podcasts that I'm looking forward to catching up, actually, because I've just been exposed to them. I've been working my way through them. I'm sure I'll get there eventually, but and I know there's new stuff coming out, so I look forward to listening to some more.
Okay, great. Thanks. Well, that's the end of this episode. Thanks for listening. And if you like what you heard, why not tell a friend about this podcast? It's available in all the usual locations. Until next time,